So, good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank everyone who is here today, especially Luke Brunning, who agreed to be with us this afternoon. Luke Brunning is author of a short but great book called Does Monogamy Work? Also, Luke Brunning is a lecturer in ethics at the University of Birmingham. His research interests are philosophy of romantic life, ethics, and philosophy of emotions. He was previously a British Academy Junior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford, where he also completed his PhD. Luke, thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to introducing some work to everyone and hearing your questions in particular. So I should say at the beginning, as I was mentioning earlier, that what I'm going to talk about is sort of in development. It's some ideas that I've been working on for a long project, and there won't be time really to go into all of that today. But I'm happy to pick up any idea or thought that I sort of set out in this talk and discuss it in more detail if you have a question. So I'm interested to hear those questions. But yeah, this is a talk that is orientated around a kind of book length project that I'm working on. And essentially what I'm trying to think about is how people respond to the contemporary romantic situation and the kinds of practical things people can do and the kinds of character traits people can develop in order to orientate themselves well to that situation. So I'm going to be thinking a little bit about our situation, how that relates to our agency, how that relates to the choice that people face when deciding what kind of romantic life to pursue, whether to pursue one that is sort of monogamous, one that is deviating from that in some way, and then thinking also a little bit about some of the virtues that people might want to cultivate in order to kind of undertake that task well. Now, we might not get onto some of the details about virtue. We only have an hour, but we can come to that in the questions and answers if that's of interest to people. But I kind of start really by sort of thinking about our position, the position of somebody who is growing up today, who wants to pursue romantic life. And we see that, in a sense, there are sort of two factors that shape that situation. And here I'm kind of thinking of the notion of situation in the way that someone like Simone de Beauvoir would use it to kind of describe the way we're kind of orientated in our social world and the various constraints that that world places on us. So we're shaped by the kinds of creatures that we are, right? So we are quite vulnerable creatures. We depend on other people. We're able to form attachments to other people. Often those attachments grip us in ways that escape our ability to reason about them. So we might wish we weren't attached to people. We might struggle with those bonds. We're also deeply shaped by our past, whether that's family context, education, specific or sort of particular forms of traumatic experience, or just the kind of ongoing flow of relationships that we have over time. We also find ourselves to be quite opaque to ourselves. It can be hard sometimes to really understand who we are, understand what we think, what we want, to really come to grips with our romantic proclivities. That can be something that often feels out of reach. We only get a kind of small glimpse here and there at the kinds of things that really excite and animate us. And not only are we quite opaque individuals, we also change a lot. And those changes that we experience often outrun our ability to make sense of them. So these can be physical changes, right? We age over time, our physical capabilities develop and alter. We go through various life stages. We go through puberty. We might go through the menopause. We might experience physical changes with our bodies as we get older, or might experience the consequence of injury. And we also find, of course, that our kind of romantic and sexual orientation to other people changes over time. So the things we desire may change, the frequency of desire may change, the kinds of person or activity that we find appealing may change. And all of this is sort of ongoing and often, again, outruns our ability to make sense of it. We also kind of find that we encounter ourselves as quite recalcitrant individuals. So we may have very well-developed thoughts about the kind of life we want, or the kind of life that it would be good to undergo, only to find that actually our feelings, our emotions and moods are in tension with that, right? So we might experience insecurity, we might experience jealousy, fear, We might experience all kinds of other strange tensions, actually. So we might think that a way of life is not good, it's bad for us, it's harmful, and yet find it really, really gripping, really exciting, and kind of find our thoughts wandering there all too often. And we also find that kind of our habits are quite recalcitrant too, right? We become fixed in our ways, it can be quite hard to change, and people often experience this in romantic life when they kind of realize that they are enacting the same patterns of behavior over and over again with different partners over time. Alongside all of this, we're also quite porous as individuals. So we're quite open to influence from other people. We often internalize other people, right? A kind of form of internal mental representations of friends and family, but also our romantic partners. And the idiolects that we form with our partners, the way that we talk to each other, we talk about environment, all of that is internalized in a way that's often quite important and very difficult to understand at the time, but becomes very noticeable when a relationship ends. And then we really feel what it's like to see the world through the eyes of somebody that's no longer there. And finally, we're also quite comparative beings. A lot of the emotions that we have seem to involve some degree of comparison between our situation and the situation experienced by somebody else, or a situation that we might imagine to happen. We also kind of develop our sense of self-identity in relationship to socially available roles, and a variety of sort of social artifacts out there that shape our self-understanding and which situate us in relationships with other people. Right, so all of these things constitute the kind of creatures we are, and we're thrown into a situation in which these constraints and dimensions shape our experience and shape our romantic experience in ways that's often unpredictable, challenging, and frustrating, quite frankly. And it's often very difficult for our kind of rational abilities to think about these things in a way that we find useful. But we don't just run up against the constraints of our creatureliness, right? We also find ourselves thrown into a social world. And that social world is structured by norms, social norms. Now, these obviously vary in different contexts, and I'm writing from the kind of perspective of someone who lives and works in the UK, and though I would be interested to see if what I say differs for other contexts, I'm not really sure. But here it's clear that romantic life is structured around sort of several core norms. The first is what Elizabeth Brake calls amatonormativity, this idea that amorous relationships, loving sort of romantic relationships are privileged in society, and they're seen to be especially important. People might think your life is not going well if you don't have a loving romantic partner, even if you're doing other things and enjoying those other things. We also find that our society is highly mononormative. It privileges monogamy, and monogamy is obviously quite a complicated notion, but we think of monogamy typically along several different dimensions. So we might think of it involving sexual exclusivity. It might also involve emotional exclusivity, in which we're forming a kind of core intimate relationship with only one person. But it also involves what I call a sort of attitudinal partisanship, in which we sort of focus on one person. We're not really thinking about others. We're not really open to the possibility of meeting other people either. And there are various sort of versions of monogamy. We might want to talk about that perhaps later in the questions. But it's a core norm that structures how we proceed in romantic life today. People that deviate from that norm are often challenged in various ways. Finally, we've got this kind of third norm, which I call sort of sex negativity. And this is basically the idea that sort of sexual attraction, desire, sexual activity is potentially dangerous. It needs managing, it needs restraining. And that mere sexual activity is negative. It's somehow not as good and not as rich and important as other kinds of interpersonal interaction and intimacy. Now, all of these norms kind of intersect, they reinforce each other, and they kind of create this broad ideal of what romantic life looks like, right? In which we find ourselves on the romantic escalator. We find ourselves ideally, in the eyes of kind of society, in a monogamous relationship with one person that contains sexual and emotional exclusivity, and that proceeds along a kind of socially predictable pattern of behavior, moving towards maybe domestic cohabitation, perhaps towards marriage, and so on. Now, obviously, these norms are kind of not the only norms in town. There are lots of other things going on, and contemporary sort of neoliberal society is suffused with other things, right? Focusing on merit and competition. an obsession with respectability, being seen to be a respectable person, but also a kind of emerging therapeutic discourse. And it's particularly noticeable when I'm sort of engaging with my students who are kind of living their lives in social media, that this kind of therapeutic discourse is really tapping into their experiences and the way that they describe certain patterns of behavior and so on in these therapeutic terms. So all of these norms kind of combined with the other constraints of our creaturely nature as human beings, put us in a certain kind of situation. We find ourselves positioned against them. We are habituated into that social space. Now, the impact of those norms on us is uneven. So some people have greater romantic privilege or intimate privilege than others, right? If you're kind of well-off white man, you might have more intimate privilege than perhaps a woman would have, or a person of color, or someone from a different social background. And so we have to think about these things with a degree of nuance. But I think that kind of summarizes really the situation that most people find themselves in. And this situation, notice, persists and still structures our kind of romantic lives despite lots of social change. So people might say, well, what about the sexual revolution? What about hookup culture? What about the ways people are kind of meeting each other on campus? All of this kind of stuff. What about increasing openness to gay marriage? What about the widespread embrace of feminism? And I would suggest that, look, despite all of that, these norms still structure our romantic life. Non-monogamy is hard for people to pursue, it's still frowned upon. It's hard for aromantic people to really convey the sense that their lives are going well, that they're flourishing, even though they lack a central amorous romantic relationship. And similarly, although we've had the sexual revolution, I think that sexuality, particularly sexuality of women and non-normative sexualities, are increasingly stereotyped and stigmatized and controlled in all kinds of ways. Now, that's not to deny, of course, that there's been a large degree of social change. And in a sense, there's a tension in how we describe what's going on here. And in the broader project, what I do is sort of position the reading of sociologist Eva Illouz against the work of Anthony Giddens, both of which are kind of looking at and describing this shift to what they call emotional modernity. That's to say, the way we're thinking about romantic culture in the 20th and 21st century. Now, broadly speaking, there's a kind of more complicated story to tell here, but the idea is that we're moving away from a situation in which romantic life and kinship were closely connected. We're moving away from a situation in which community life was central and strong. We're moving away from a situation in which romantic rituals governed courtship, marriage, and the life cycle. And we're moving towards a more individualistic, fragmented, and potentially, in the eyes of some people, democratic and sort of egalitarian context. Now, Eva Illouz, who's written several wonderful books, thinking about these changes, the emergence of contemporary romantic life, and the impact of that on individuals, sort of thinks that, look, one of the things that's going on in modern life is that romantic life, the choice of a partner, the kind of relationship we have, is become increasingly a matter of expertise, something we need to become good at, we need to master, we need to navigate like we might navigate the economic market, like we might navigate education, like we might navigate other things. And alongside this, we also get this notion of casualness emerging, where people are experimenting, exploring, engaging in kind of serial monogamy, thinking about their kind of sexual identity, their romantic identity, in a quite consumerist way, essentially. And she describes the story in great length, but she suggests that, look, what's happening is we're moving to a situation in which romantic life is suffused with what she calls negative sexual relations, in which we're failing really to recognize other people and engaging more in projects of self-expression and of autonomy assertion. Now, there's a lot to say about Illouz's work, and one of the things I find interesting actually is that, the picture she describes is on its face a really quite bleak one, but actually in her most recent book, she kind of seems to me anyway to undermine the negative implications of this, right? She suggests, well, there's no real moral implications to these phrases, positive and negative and so on. But I disagree, right? And so when we think about the impact of this on people, we see that it leads to several outcomes. So uncertainty predominates when people nowadays are trying to find a romantic partner. People are often unclear about whether they're on dates with other people. People are often unsure because they lack social and communal rituals about the feelings of another person or their intentions. And so we end up with a kind of structural uncertainty, which overlays many kinds of romantic experience. But alongside that, we also have a kind of abundance of choice available to people. But that choice combined with this sense that we need to be exhibiting romantic expertise leads to a kind of choice fatigue, a choice anxiety, and uncertainty about whether we're making a good choice, whether someone is right for us, whether they're compatible, whether this kind of relationship is going to go far, and so on. And this generates uncertainty and anxiety, which are bad in themselves, but it perhaps also inhibits our ability really to kind of relate to each other in a good way, and to recognize each other as kind of vulnerable human beings thrown into a kind of situation that is complicated and constraining. So we might sort of talk in more detail about what's going on, but the underlying thought that I have here is that, look, when you're situated in this way, when you find yourself in this kind of romantic space as a kind of vulnerable creature that doesn't really understand their desires and emotions very well, and whose rational ability to tame their emotions is often lacking, you become habituated to that context, right? You develop certain practical strategies in order to try and get through it and find someone and kind of create something that looks like a reasonable romantic life. So people might adopt the strategy of trying not to seem needy, right? They want to seem confident and assertive, so they might try and withdraw and hide some of their emotions. They might detach emotionally from other people because they're anticipating the possibility that a date won't go anywhere or a relationship will fall apart or something like that. And they might embrace a kind of romantic irony. But people also develop a kind of meta-emotional monitoring where they're kind of looking at their emotions, trying to work out how they feel and trying to calculate the extent to which they want to risk investment, risk vulnerability and intimacy with other people. And so people kind of developing all of these kind of strategies, and maybe some of those things appeal to you. But when you think about it, that situation is kind of damaging to people. And I like to think about this in terms of an idea from the virtue ethicist feminist Lisa Tessman, who writes about the impact of oppressive contexts on individuals. So one of the problems that people in these situations face is that they often develop character traits and practical strategies to deal with things in their social world. And I think we can draw analogies between contexts of really severe oppression, racism, for example, and the strategies that people develop to cope with that, and the constraining context of romantic life. And what we see is that people develop either traits which are in tension with them relating well to other people. So they might become jealous, they might ironic distance, they might be constantly comparing themselves to other people to try and work out where they're situated in the kind of romantic market. Or people, in virtue of the way that romantic life is structured, kind of fail to develop useful traits. So they fail to become good at communicating. They might find themselves adopting a useful trait, for example, caution, being cautious, but find that it's entrenched and it's over-dominating in ways which aren't very helpful to them, right? And so the thought is all of this stuff taken together really means that people often find themselves in a kind of troubling situation. That's my interpretation of what Elise is saying. Now, we might want to contrast what she's saying with the kind of optimism of someone like Giddens, who thinks, look, this slow move to emotional modernity, this kind of movement away from ritual, from community, from kinship, towards a sense of individual choice, a sense of autonomy, a sense of exploration. This is potentially a good thing, right? It can allow people to relate to each other as equals. It can perhaps make relationships more democratic in the sense that people are thinking about what they want, voicing their opinions, and making decisions on the basis of those opinions. So they're kind of active agents. And fundamentally, he thinks that, look, romantic life is increasingly organized around autonomy, and that's no bad thing. We want to be autonomous individuals. And so we have this kind of tension. On the one hand, modern romantic life, it can seem messy and it can seem frustrating, perhaps when you're dating or something. But actually, that's a good thing, all things considered, because it gives you the space to explore and to find somebody that suits you. On the other hand, we might think that the uncertainty, the frustration, this need for expertise, the kind of sense of not knowing what people think about you, how you relate to yourself, that is harmful and undermines the quality of relationships that people have. Now, this is kind of my starting point. My starting point is, look, you find yourself in this complicated and ambivalent social situation. What are you going to do about it? How do we proceed with this? And to me, it's an ethical question. It's a practical question that many people face. And it's one that might sort of enter into the process of deciding whether to have a relationship or who to have a relationship with. But it also enters into the kind of practical process of thinking, well, what should this relationship be like? What is it that I want out of a romantic life? Do I want to kind of have the kind of relationship that my parents and grandparents had? Do I want to do something different? If so, what would that look like? And of course, when faced with this kind of complicated and some might say uncertain, anxiety-inducing kind of romantic chaos, one natural thing that people say is, well, the way out of this is kind of to reject those dominant norms, right? Like, why think that we have to have a central loving relationship? Why think we have to be monogamous? Why think that we should downplay sexuality, right? We kind of get rid of these norms. And this is a very attractive thought to many people. And they think, look, maybe non-monogamy kind of stands there as an alternative to romantic modernity. Now, I think there's a lot to be said about this. And in the longer project, I sort of think about various objections that people might have to that idea, right? That they might say, look, actually embracing non-monogamy is kind of one way of taking all of the bad stuff about contemporary romantic life, the consumerism, the individualism, the greed, all of that, the unfairness, and sort of packaging that into a lifestyle, right? That kind of non-monogamy is a way of just enacting neoliberal romantic sensibilities writ large. There's a lot to say. We could kind of push back on against those arguments. I think they're not very good. They don't really make sense. There's a lot of fine detail that we could look at, right? But some people go further. They say, okay, look, we've rejected that argument, but here's a stronger argument to think that actually monogamy in particular is sort of morally bad and it's morally impermissible. And so I want to think about this idea for a little bit because it's shaping my thinking about romantic life and it's shaping my thinking about agency. So let's focus a little bit on one person's specific argument. So there's a person called Harry Chalmers, and he wrote a paper a couple of years ago in which he tries to argue that, look, monogamy is morally impermissible. And basically he wants to motivate this by an analogy. So he wants to get you thinking about two people who are in a romantic relationship who are also friends with each other. And they agree that neither of them is able to have any additional friends. And if either of them forms an additional friendship, their partner will refuse to support them, withdraw their love and affection, and perhaps break off the relationship. Now, he starts with this thing and says, well, imagine that kind of situation, right? We think that's morally troubling. We think that's problematic. We think there's something wrong about that perhaps people are missing out on an important good of human friendship, or that we're restricting the freedom of our partner. And he develops this into an argument. So he suggests, look, monogamy is kind of similar to this. It involves this categorical restriction on a partner having more than one amorous relationship at the same time. And that's a problem because amorous relationships are important human goods and they contribute to our well-being. And so this restriction is prima facie morally impermissible. For it to be permissible, it would have to be justified by some good-making feature of this restriction, something about that restriction that is actively contributing good to people's lives. And in the argument that he develops, he says, look, there isn't any such feature. And so what he does is he sort of thinks about things that people say about non-monogamy, right? Oh, it's, about monogamy, that it's more practical, that it helps people avoid jealousy and so on. And he goes through these claims and suggests that they're not very good. And he's recently defended this actually in an article published a few weeks ago. So I think this is a kind of interesting starting point because it's making the stronger claim that not only is it not the case that monogamy, that non-monogamy isn't bad, but actually monogamy is bad. Now, I think the argument is actually, in some senses, quite interesting and plausible I think he's made a reasonable good argument that actually the traditional candidates that people point to say why monogamy is particularly important don't really work, right? So monogamy doesn't really necessarily make relationships more special, doesn't make them more practical, doesn't necessarily make them more free of jealousy. And, you know, if you disagree with that, we could perhaps talk about that later. But, you know, notions of practicality, for example, are very, very contingent and very closely related to the wider circumstances of your life. And for somebody, one thing might be very impractical, which is very easy for another person, and vice versa. And we can make similar claims about some of the other things that are said. So there's a lot of detail, which I can't really talk about here. But I want to think a little bit more about that friendship analogy. Right. So when we think about it, we think, oh, look, that just seems really unreasonable. And there is something really morally concerning about someone who's trying to restrict someone else's ability to form additional friendships. But actually, when we think about it a little bit more and think about the scope of these kind of claims, we see that maybe our intuitions shift a little bit if the restrictions involved aren't so extreme. So if that person turned to their partner and said, look, I don't want you to have a friendship with this person, this particular individual. Like, I don't want you to be friends with my boss, or I don't want you to be friends with that person that abused me, or I don't want you to be friends with somebody that works for the dominant political party, or whatever it may be. That's a specific individual person that this person is pointing out and saying, look, friendship with that particular person is problematic. I think some people at least would think, well, that seems much more reasonable. More broadly, that person might say, look, you can have friends. So of course, have many friends you like, but just don't have friends with people of this category. So don't be friends with any of the members of the occupying army that are occupying our territory right now. I think, you know, I wouldn't continue my relationship with you if you were friends with those people. That's something that someone might say, and that we might think, well, maybe there's something okay there. It's not similar to the initial worry that Chalmers had. Similarly, we might think there might be cases where we'd ask somebody not to go out and form new friendships for a specific time period, or until certain conditions are met, right? Until we finish this project, until the end of the holiday, until I get better from surgery, until I finally die from this terminal illness, to use an extreme example. So the thought is, okay, when we make this general claim, as Chalmers does, there does seem to be something problematic about excluding other people. It seems troubling. But when we make that claim more specific, it seems more reasonable. So why is that? Why does that seem correct, at least to me and to other people I've spoken to? Well, one thought is that, look, when we make those requests of people to avoid specific kinds of relationship, we're leaving them with, you know, sufficient open options, so they can have friendships with other people, or they can have friendships with other times of their life, or whenever. And so although this other person misses out on something, they don't miss out in a kind of overly burdensome or unreasonable way. They miss out in a more localized way. And there might be other reasons why they're missing out as a good thing. We might also think, or at least some people think, I'm not sure what I think about this, that sometimes restrictions like that can manifest care, or show that another person is taking our wishes seriously, or we're taking their wishes seriously. So we might call this something like loyalty, for example. You know, if we work for a political party and we say to our partner, I don't want you to be friends with any of the people on the other party, the people that are trying to take away our education and healthcare, or something like that. Some people might think, well, okay, in kind of honoring that, it's exhibiting loyalty, and that loyalty is a good thing. We can maybe park that if you don't think that that's plausible. More interestingly, though, for my purposes, the thought is that these kinds of exclusions that people might ask of each other seem to create and help people maintain their agency. And here I'm kind of influenced by something that Quill Kukla mentions in another context, very briefly. So Quill's writing about an argument by someone called Halle Liberto, which focuses on promises in sexual contexts. So Liberto wants to argue that, look, we can't promise to have sex with someone because to do so would be morally impermissible. It would be wrong for somebody to accept such a promise because it gives them kind of moral control over someone else's actions and behavior. So quickly sort of talking about this and thinking, okay, maybe that's right. But what happens when we think about negative sexual promises, like making the promise not to do something? And they suggest that, look, and I'm quoting now, if we look at more fine-grained sexual negotiations, negative promises become important tools for creating ethical and agency-enhancing possibilities, right? And I think this is easy to see in the sexual context. So promising a partner that you're not going to do a certain thing or undergo a certain action or mention something that's perhaps triggering to them, what that does is it enables that other person to be open to intimacy, sexual enjoyment, and whatever, without being concerned that their agency is going to be undermined, right? So these kinds of exclusions help people prop up their agency. And the thought here is that perhaps we can generalize this idea to the romantic context more broadly. And we think a little bit about the way that exclusions, saying, don't do this, don't do that, and don't do the other, might help people support their agency. And we can think about this in terms of perhaps a trade-off that Chalmers overlooks in his argument. So one of the strands of the argument is this worry that monogamy restricts people's freedom, right? And it restricts their freedom and limits their access to important goods. And the thought is, well, that kind of restriction is bad unless we can say why it's justified. But we might think, well, hang on a minute. Having access in some abstract sense to various good things is only valuable to us if we have the ability or abilities to actually enjoy those things. And when we look at the romantic context, I think we need to think carefully about whether everyone has that same ability to enjoy intimacy from the offset. So when we're thinking more generally about abilities in context of freedom, we might worry that not everyone has the same ability to enjoy certain goods. We might also worry that their ability to enjoy their goods is conditional on the cooperation of other people or is perhaps relational in some way. The good of security seems to be like that. And we also might want to think a little bit about whether the enjoyment of one kind of good in life would actually sort of impact your ability to enjoy subsequent units of good. And that's something that typically arises with beer and other forms of good thing in life, right? The more you have, the less able you are to enjoy the next unit of it. Now, if we kind of express these kind of general worries back in terms of freedom, we see that perhaps we might want to limit our freedom understood negatively as the absence of restrictions, if that helps people experience what we might call, following people in the literature, sort of positive freedom, right? The ability to actually master your life and benefit from the opportunities and things available to you. And this might be very important in cases where we're acting alongside other people, right? We might need to restrict each other's freedoms in order to allow ourselves to benefit from the things that we have, right? So we might need to have some kinds of restrictions on how people can come to acquire property so that we can have a predictable, chaos-free sense of how our lives are working. Or we might need to restrict people's ability to enter our houses at nighttime just so that we have the ability to sleep well, not worrying about what's going on. And we'd accept that even if it incurs a reciprocal loss of freedom on our part, right? That we're not allowed to enter other people's houses. So one thought here is something like this, right? So Chalmers is worrying that, well, monogamy restricts your freedom to have other kinds of intimacy. And we might agree that that's what monogamy does. But perhaps those restrictions can actually help you maintain or perhaps even increase your ability to enjoy the goods of intimacy that you do have. So the thought here is at the very least, there might be trade-offs between the mere ability to access things without negative consequences and the ability to actually enjoy the goods that you access. So at the very least, there's a trade-off there. If having loads of freedom to have extra relationships actually undermines your ability to enjoy them for whatever reason, we might think, well, okay, maybe we need to balance these things off against each other. More strongly, though, we might think, look, the ability to enjoy goods takes priority. That ability to make use of whatever freedom you have should be protected above those freedoms themselves, because it's the thing that you need in order for that additional freedom to have value. So this is a kind of train of thought that we have about agency in the romantic context. And this raises some questions. So we might ask, well, what does this kind of ability to enjoy romantic goods mean? I mean, that sounds a bit odd. And why might we think that maybe some of the kind of exclusions that people typically place on each other when they're in monogamous relationships sort of help them maintain these abilities? And we might also ask ourselves, well, maybe the kind of expansiveness that's central to some kinds of non-monogamy might also play a similar role. It might also kind of help people with some abilities in some way. And if that's right, then the possibility of these kind of trade-offs and this slight shift of focus towards abilities in romantic contexts might complicate or kind of undermine any kind of straightforward binary when we're choosing between monogamy or non-monogamy. Instead, we might need to think carefully about the connection between freedom to access goods and the ability to access those goods. And more generally, you might need to look very specifically at the kinds of practical agreements we come up with our partners when thinking about how our lives are going. Now, it could be the case as well that traditional defenses of monogamy are kind of overestimating the extent to which the exclusions they involve on kind of intimacy and sex and desire, whatever, that those exclusions allow us to enjoy the intimacy that we have, right? So it could be the case that that is not correct. But it could also be the case that some exclusions, some restrictions on each other's freedom are important for people in some contexts, or perhaps important for lots of people. And if this is the case, then it might be that there's no real good-making feature of monogamy or non-monogamy as such, but we need to kind of evaluate from our own personal perspective how each different relationship style would impact our agency, our ability to make use of the freedoms that we have. And so this raises a kind of really pressing practical question, which is, would a monogamous relationship or a non-monogamous relationship be good for me? Is it justified for me? And that kind of practical question, when understood in terms of agency, starts us on a path where we start thinking about the kinds of character traits that people would need to answer it well. And so if we have time, we might talk a bit about realism as a trait of character. We might talk about integrity and some other things later down the line. Another thing, though, I think that Chalmers has overlooked when thinking about this friendship analogy, and this comes out when we start thinking a little bit about freedom, and we kind of run with this analogy between that context and sort of political philosophy more generally. But we might think, well, why don't we just look at the conditions under which this restriction is imposed, right? So it might definitely seem morally troubling for one person just to kind of arbitrarily decide to prevent the other person from accessing some good stuff in life. But if those two individuals agree themselves to impose those restrictions mutually on themselves, we might think that very process of mutual agreement and the kind of symmetry involved in that situation is morally significant in some way. There's something important about that we might want to respect. So putting it simply, we might think that that's a situation in which people are exercising mutual authority over each other. And that's something that's important. We can't just neglect that. We should resist thinking that those situations where we decide to adopt a monogamous or non-monogamous style of romantic life are directly similar to a situation in which one person is just imposing restrictions on another. Clearly, it's not like that. And I think that thought that there's some kind of reciprocal meeting of minds is what really interested Giddens, actually, when he was talking about democracy in romantic life. There's something significant about that kind of authority. If we had a bit more time, we would talk also here about another kind of freedom that's mentioned in the literature. So we've talked about negative freedom, the ability to do stuff without being restricted. We've also talked about positive freedom, the ability to actually govern one's life and benefit from the goods that are available out there. But we might also think, and lots of people have argued, that maybe freedom should be understood in another way, or there's a different kind of freedom, which is being free from domination. So in the literature, this will be called Republican freedom. So we might think that if we find ourselves in a social relationship where we are dependent on somebody that has some kind of arbitrary power over us, then our freedom is restricted, even if that person doesn't occupy that power. So we might have no real restrictions on what we can do. We might have lots of ability to do stuff, right? We might be have loads of money. We might have lots of time. We might be physically very able, and yet we might be dominated by someone. So a classic example of what this might be like is if we're living under a tyrannical regime and we're kind of a close associate of this tyrant. So the tyrant gives us loads of money. We've got loads of time. The tyrant's not going to stop us doing anything, or at least they haven't yet. But there's always this possibility that at any moment they might change their mind, or that at any moment the wheel of fortune will spin and we'll find ourselves in a much worse off place than we started. And the thought is that structural situation is dominating. It's bad for us to be in that situation. So we might think this also applies in romantic context as well. So not only do we want to have some freedom to do things that we want, and we want to have the ability to actually benefit from those forms of intimacy, we also don't want to be in a situation where someone else has a kind of arbitrary power over us. And so there's a kind of important third strand to this that we might come back to, and I think that is actually lurking behind Giddens's thinking. This idea that it's important for modern romantic relationships to be ones that avoid arbitrary domination. So the natural answer to all of this, right, is to say, look, you've discussed various kinds of freedom, but what we want in romantic life is kind of all of this freedom. We want the freedom to pursue things that we find attractive. We want the ability to enjoy them if we're able to find them. And we also don't want to be kind of subject to other people's arbitrary power. But of course, the problem here is that in practice, complicated trade-offs will always have to be made between these forms of freedom. And this is something that is very clear to political philosophers in a broader context, and it applies definitely in the context of romantic life. And we find also that our agency in romantic life is particularly fragile. It's something that can be very easily undermined. And this is where we kind of have to start asking additional questions and thinking a little bit more about this kind of agency. So we want to ask ourselves, well, how does agency work in romantic life? And then we might want to ask ourselves, well, how do certain kinds of romantic relationships shape that agency? So I'll say a little bit about this now, though, of course, there's a lot more to say about this. So what I'm trying to do in my broader work really is to get us thinking about what I'm calling kind of romantic agency. And underpinning this idea is the premise that the way we engage practically with romantic life, the kinds of evaluative framework we adopt, the kinds of things that we think about each other, the kind of decisions we make, all of that should be shaped in some minimal way by an understanding of what romantic life is actually like and what relationships are like. And that contrasts with idealizations, right? Like ideals of what we want it to be like, visions in novels and films, and kind of the seductions of romantic ideology. And so I'm trying to suggest that we need to think about romantic life in terms of agency. And what's interesting about this kind of agency in the romantic context is that it's highly relational. Our ability to do things as romantic persons is shaped by, but also shapes the relationships we have with other people. So let's think a bit about this, right? So what do I mean by romantic agency? Well, my broad and sketchy definition of this is that it's our kind of agential capacities as romantic individuals. So that's to say, our ability to experience, to imagine, to act on intimate context with other people, our ability to act on sexual desire and attraction, and our ability to sustain romantic relationships. There's some caveats here about the relationship between agency and autonomy and flourishing and so on, and we could maybe talk about that later, but I'm not defining this in terms of autonomous agency either. I'm just talking about our general abilities and capacities that we have. Now, sort of the two kind of claims I want to make about this. The first is that romantic agency, our ability to be romantic people, is highly fragile. We shouldn't assume that everyone has these abilities, and we shouldn't assume that everyone has them to the same extent. It's fragile because of all of the reasons I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. We find ourselves situated in a complicated and often hostile social world that's fraught with uncertainty and ambivalence. But it's also fragile because of those facts about us as creatures, the way that we form attachments without really being able to rationally control them, the way that our emotions often hit us out of nowhere without us really understanding what's going on, the way that we can be drawn back to experiences from our past that we would rather forget. All of that stuff makes romantic agency pretty fragile. The second thing I want to say is that this ability to be a romantic person is developed and maintained largely within romantic relationships themselves. Right? We develop the ability to be a good romantic partner on the job, rather than in some other context prior to that. Now, of course, someone's going to say, well, what about the family situation? What about friendships? What about all of these other things? And I agree that, of course, they structure our agency and our agential capabilities. But you can still be a good friend and a good family member and be very bad at romantic life, be a bad romantic partner, be a bad sexual partner. And learning what it is to engage in those kinds of intimacy well is something that you do inside romantic relationships themselves and in connection, in relation to other people. So this kind of idea that romantic agency is deeply relational really, on the one hand, it's kind of an obvious point, but I think it changes and shifts how we think about romantic life away from the kind of individualistic mode that Aluz is worried about, in which we see ourselves as individuals with fixed capabilities that we know about in advance, who pursue the things that we want, which we also know about and desire in advance. And we focus on this notion of compatibility, finding someone else that allows us to satisfy those pre-known desires and goods, perhaps in a kind of contractual style, right? We need to shift away from that individual mode towards a kind of relational mode, in which our abilities, our capabilities are kind of structured around and held and supported by other people, in which we are often driven by intimations rather than clear knowledge, right? We're seeing where something is leading. We're not really sure where it's going. We're emphasizing practices. We're being driven by guidelines rather than sort of hard rules. And we're focusing on the kinds of thing that emerge in concert with other people rather than a kind of hard and fast notion of compatibility to begin with. Now, there's a lot more to say about the kinds of relationality, as it were, that find themselves in romantic life. We might talk about the epistemic dimensions, the way in which other people help us learn about ourselves and come to know things about ourselves. We might talk about desire. We might talk, for example, about how engagement with specific individuals in certain contexts can elicit new desires, or we can talk about how desire is reactive often. That to be able to experience a certain desire might depend on someone else responding to us in a certain way. We might also talk about relationality in terms of value. And here I'm thinking of a lovely, albeit slightly complicated paper by Benjamin Bagley, where he talks of romantic relationships as contexts of deep improvisation. They're contexts in which someone else helps us fill out or determine what it is we value, right? We think we value stuff, but actually those values emerge and are kind of sustained by someone else in a kind of complicated reciprocal activity together. And this is kind of a complicated claim, but I think that it's interesting because it puts pressure on this idea that we are individuals looking for people that share our values in all cases, and that we can make sure that we're compatible by being sure that we are sharing values with each other. Instead, it leaves open the possibility that what it is we value and the ways in which we value it are structured and formulated only in relationship with a specific other individual that can't be swapped out for someone else in the same way, and that can't be replaced. And that's an argument that I find very interesting. I'm not really sure I fully understand the detail. It's a complicated paper, and I urge you to read it. I think it's really interesting. But I think that there is a lot in this idea that actually we value things in quite a general and abstract way, and it's our relationships with other people that add content or flesh out those forms of valuing. But there's more, right? It's not just that. So we might think, well, romantic life is structured around narrative as well. So we have a sense of who we are, what we're doing, like how our life is going. But we need to think that that's also a very relational notion, that we are kind of co-authoring narratives with our romantic partners, and that they shape us in various kinds of ways. Now, those kinds of shaping that we undergo they're not always conscious, they're not always active. Sometimes they are. So sometimes we will converse with someone, they'll give us guidance, they'll criticize us, they'll say that, you know, the things we're talking about are nonsense, or that we shouldn't do this or do that, or we shouldn't cook the dinner in that way, or whatever. And we learn from that, and we learn from joint activities. But we also are shaped passively by other people just by being in a certain environment. So moving from a kind of chaotic, noisy, loud, violent household to a calm, quiet, safe feeling, romantic context can really shape people in ways that they might not even be able to explain at the time, in ways that they might find quite wonderful, but kind of strange to them. And similarly, we just finding ourselves in certain interpersonal dynamics can really help change and structure our abilities as well, right? And this is something that I think a lot of feminists have focused on when thinking about sort of consciousness raising, various kinds of dynamic of interaction, and the importance of those dynamics when it comes to aligning newly formed kind of thoughts about what kind of life we want to lead with the practical and emotional ability to put that into action. And there's even more stuff that we could talk about. So we could talk about the way in which our ongoing sort of romantic life is structured by the shadows of past relationships, and the way that they interact and kind of affect our sense of what we're doing. And some of you may have experienced this when, you know, you're interacting with a new partner, but you're sort of still thinking about everything in terms of the language that you shared with an old partner, or something like that. But what I'm saying here is that we need to focus on the ways in which our ability to be intimate, our ability to form romantic bonds, to be open to whatever it may be, sexual or emotional intimacy, is itself something that is shaped very intimately by another person in ways we cannot always predict in advance, in ways which are deeply productive, and in ways that are very fragile, and ways that we need to respect, right? And so they're fragile for a variety of reasons. They're fragile because of the broad social context that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that we're kind of habituated into a social world full of norms and ideals, many of which are changing or in flux or sit uneasily with us. They are fragile also because we're deeply vulnerable to other people. And that vulnerability is there whether we like it or not, and often it's in conflict with what we think or feel about it. Also, this kind of vulnerability and dependence mean that we are finding ourselves in contexts where we may actually be open to being dominated by people in the sense that I mentioned above, that is to say, being vulnerable to their arbitrary power because we depend on them in some way. And this kind of context obviously can really entrench patterns of evasion, self-preservation, where people are trying to kind of preserve themselves and their sense of who they are from all of these pressures. But, you know, romantic agency can also be undermined by loads of other things as well. So general patterns of behavior, if someone's unreceptive to you, that might really sort of grate against your attachment style. If someone's gaslighting you, for example, that may be very deeply undermining when it comes to your ability to engage as an intimate person with someone else, to understand what it is you're thinking, what you desire, what you value. That could be very chaotic and confused. Similarly, being triggered into experiencing or reliving past events or traumatic experiences can make it very difficult for someone to be romantically intimate or open to other people. And of course, violence and other things really undermine people's ability to benefit from any kinds of romantic freedom. Okay, so you might say, well, these behaviors can arise in other relationships too, and that's definitely the case, but they're certainly exacerbated in the intimate context because of these relational features that I've mentioned earlier. Now, why is all of this relevant? Well, it helps to structure the kinds of decisions that we have to make. So we have to choose what kind of general romantic life are we going to have. Is it going to be monogamous? Is it going to be non-monogamous? If it's non-monogamous, what kind of form is it going to take? Are we going to have a group relationship? Are we going to have some kind of open relationship? That's kind of broad, general practical question. But there are much more specific practical questions that people have to have, right? So, you know, even if you settle on a monogamous or non-monogamous form of life, you need to figure out exactly how your relationship with other people is going to work. What are the guidelines that you follow? What are the expectations that you have for your partner? How are things going to work over time? So we need to make these practical decisions. And the thought that I arrive at and that I'm thinking about in great detail is about how those decisions ought to pay attention to the ways in which our ability to be romantic persons might be either supported or undermined by the things that we're doing. And this is relevant because it can be in tension with what we want, right? We might want a form of romantic life that is very open and free and allows us to have all of these experiences, only to be aware that actually we're going to find that very challenging. We're going to experience various kinds of trauma. It's going to impact our ability to have attachments or whatever it may be. Or we might think that what we want is to have a relationship like our grandparents had, a monogamous one, only to find that actually that really impinges on our agency in certain ways that are quite frustrating and problematic. And so what I kind of go on to do in the broader project really is to think a little bit about ways in which expanding kind of romantic life away from a sort of traditional monogamous relationship can help people support their agency, but also thinking about ways in which perhaps making some exclusions, some restrictions might support people's agency. Contra what Chalmers had to say about this, where he sort of thinks all of those restrictions are bad, there's nothing good to be said about them. Well, the thought is, well, actually, in many cases, those restrictions are really important. They're ways in which people shore up their ability to be romantic persons. Now, this leaves open the possibility that actually the social context can be so problematic, can be so fraught and fragile, that many people might think that actually very extensive restrictions are needed if they're going to be able to have romantic relationships, right? It may be the case. I mean, this is an open question, and we've got to be careful with this question because it's obviously one in which different kinds of prejudice may bear on. But we might think that for somebody that finds themselves in this kind of complicated world in which monogamy is still privileged, but they're unsure about how to go about dating, they don't know how other people feel about them, they're feeling a lot of insecurity and jealousy and so on, then maybe for that person, the ability to have a kind of relationship with someone else really does require quite a lot of restrictions to their romantic freedom and that of their partner, right? That's a possibility. So that's one way in which my view kind of differs perhaps with people that want to take a more direct line of attack against things like monogamy. But it also extends to other kinds of non-conventional relationship, which on paper may sound like they're expanding freedom and allowing people to access various kinds of goods that are good in life, things that may all be true in principle, but they may not be things that individuals are actually able to access, practically speaking. And it may be the case that certain kinds of non-monogamous dynamic undermine or exacerbate the fragility that's inherent in romantic life. And if that's the case, it may be that individuals need to decide that those forms of life aren't for them because of the impact that they'd have on their agency. Just like the person in the kind of quote kukla sexual context might have to decide that doing certain kinds of things just really isn't for them because it's too traumatic or difficult or something that they can't countenance. And it would really undermine their ability to be intimate at all with someone else if they went through with that. So that's, broadly speaking, kind of where this talk is going to end. Now, there are a whole load of other questions that we want to ask, right? So even if we have a sense of what kind of relationship patterns and policies and configurations and how they might kind of shape people's agency in very general terms, obviously that doesn't really help us when we're thinking about ourselves specifically as individuals, because we need to pay attention to our own context. And so having a rough sense of the kinds of forms of organization that are available to us takes us so far. But what we need beyond that are a suite of romantic virtues in order to make these decisions in the right way. So we need to be able to deliberate with our partners in a realistic way, in a way that's not deformed by seductive romantic ideology, in a way that is free from various kinds of pressure, and in a way that attends to the particularity of our own character, that of our partner, that of our social context, and allows us to make these decisions in ways that will help preserve our agency. So we need to be realistic. But realism only gets us so far, because there might be cases where we have to take a risk. I mean, all romantic life involves risks. And there are questions that people have about whether it's reasonable to undergo a form of unconventional romantic life if you're just unsure really finally in the final thought as to whether you're competent to see it through. Some people say, well, no, that's not morally acceptable. And of course, my worry there is that entrenches the status quo. It stops people from being able to ever move away from how things are now. And that would be deeply problematic. And so we need to start thinking a little bit about the kinds of integrity that people need in order to take those risks in the right kind of way, and what that involves. Does that involve making a plan and sticking to it, or does it involve something more flexible? And I favor a much more flexible approach, which reflects the relationality that I talked about earlier. There are also other things that I mentioned. I can't talk about them in any detail, but I'll just state them. So we also need to be playful. I think playfulness is very important when it comes to confronting difficult situations, uncertain situations, in a way that's productive, in a way which is error-friendly. We also need to be able to manage our emotions, both the emotions that we experience, but also the emotions that we undergo from other people. If we can't handle our emotions, if we can't manage hard feelings, if we can't be receptive to the emotions of other people, none of this is really going to work. Because of the problem I mentioned right at the beginning, which is that our emotions often come out of nowhere and conflict very heavily, very viscerally with what we think about romantic life. So we need to be able to do that. But finally, we also need to be able to attend to each other, right? Managing your emotions is one thing, but if you're unable to really think about and attend to the good things in someone else's romantic life, and the good things in one's own romantic life, then you're going to be very limited, and it's going to affect your ability to have a flourishing romantic life. But I think I'll leave it there for today. So that's a sort of central part of a broader argument that I'm developing. I'll be really interested if you have any questions or thoughts about it. So yeah, and thank you very much for having me. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luke. We have a question by Eduardo. What will be the core of values? What will be the core values of marriage between people who don't want to regulate their behavior by normativity?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. So I would have to think about that, but I assume the thought would be something like trying to resist the overt sense that like their relationship and the kind of romantic love that they have is distinct from or special when compared to other kinds of relationships of family and friends. And also putting that into practice. So people often talk about things like dyadic withdrawal, where romantic couples often withdraw from really seeing their friends very much, their family. The romantic context, domestic life becomes a kind of separate zone in which people retreat to, and those other relationships fade away. So presumably someone would try to resist that in practice if they could. Perhaps they wouldn't even live together, for example. They might embrace a non-domestic relationship. They might be very open to their partner having other kinds of very intense or well-developed friendships, collegiate relationships, caring relationships with other people. So it would kind of involve a sort of retelling of the romantic narrative, right? And sort of saying, well, instead of us ending up in a secluded little home somewhere with our perfect little family and sort of all tucked away like that, we'd be much more open to other kinds of interaction and intimacy in our lives. Yeah, I think that's what I'd say to that.
Thank you for that. We have another one by Eduardo too. So the practical agency is related to choices, to plans and possibilities. For many, perhaps they are mistaken. Our romantic life is something that happens to us passively. How can we reconcile this active and passive tension?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So I think that's kind of why we need these virtues. We need the ability to recognize that romantic life is like that we can't do everything in advance. We can't just sort of enter into the fray knowing who we are, knowing what we want, knowing what we are like, and then just choose someone that ticks all those boxes and everything follows from that. Instead, we have to be open to the fact that actually a lot of what happens, a lot of what we come to know, come to want, come to value, will emerge in concert with someone else in ways that are really unpredictable, ways that will change us. So we have to go into it knowing that, right? And we have to be able to handle that. And I think the ability to handle that requires, these virtues that I've mentioned. So thinking a little bit about realism. It's often seen as a really boring thing, right? Being realistic. But actually realism, I think, is incredibly important when it comes to romantic life. The ability, as I understand it, to notice and to see the array of kind of competing ideologies and sort of stories out there, whether that's kind of monogamous ideology or non-monogamous ideology. Sort of, I think I called it in some early article. We've got this the vision of the one, you know, Mr. Right, Mrs. Right, for the monogamous, but you've also got the vision of the many, right? This idea of this kind of more open, more expansive, kind of polycule, or whatever you want to call it, intimate family, which also can be seductive, and it can be unrealistic for people. I mean, you can be seduced by either of these stories, right? So people have to be aware that they need to make decisions without being seduced. And of course, making a decision is just one thing, right? Deciding to have a certain kind of relationship is the easy part in a way. It's actually getting on with it that's the hard part, and that's where people need to develop a kind of operational form of integrity. And I'm really influenced by Margaret Walker and her writing on integrity, which I think is fantastic. So she's sort of saying, look, we need to resist this idea that we are these little career cells, we're these little autonomous persons, and we know what we want, and we kind of go out and get it, and that's it. And that to have a life is to kind of make a plan and put the plan into action. Instead, she thinks of integrity not as sort of sticking to what we said we would do in this kind of rigid way, but as a kind of ongoing moral sensitivity to our actions, to how they impact other people. Sometimes that only comes into play when we've already screwed up, right? And so for her, integrity is a really complicated and messy moral character or trait that we need. And I think in the romantic context, that's very important, because we are often shaped passively, or experience our kind of romantic situation passively. People can do things that they don't intend to do that'll hurt us, and we have to be able to deal with that. So that involves us being open to error, being friendly with error. But people are going to make loads and loads of mistakes in romantic life all the time. So that's something we need to be happy with. And I think that ties into, the virtue of playfulness. This ability to be open to these things in a way that is not contractual, not sort of saying, oh, well, 2 years ago you said A, B, C, subclause, D, E, F, and actually can sort of see that things change, they develop, they evolve. So that's not really it's not a practical answer, right? Because basically the answer is, well, you've got to be a certain kind of person. But I think it's the only answer in town, really. And that people that want a kind of clear, practical thing to just do tomorrow are missing the point, right? They are ultimately wedded to a notion of compatibility, that if I just found the right person, if I just made the right decision on a Friday morning, then everything else will run smoothly. And that's not how it works at all.
I love the idea of playfulness. I think that's very nice to think about relationships in those terms, right? Especially when we're taking the subject so seriously, and then we are reminded that there needs to be playfulness in how we think about our relationships. That's really
Definitely.
nice.
And I just want to also just say that, so I think that's really right. And I think one objection people might raise to all of this talk that I've given and my work is like, well, it's so philosophical, it's so serious, it's so theoretical, And I want to be clear that none of that has to kind of transfer over to the practical situation of someone that's thinking about this, right? They don't need a degree in sociology and philosophy to do this stuff. It's instead just thinking, well, look, what kind of relationship do I want? Being aware that their decision is shaped by their social context, and all of these kind of traits can be developed in a very ordinary way. It's not complicated, difficult. It can be fun and easy and kind of playful to do this.
We have another question. Before I go to the next question, I was curious about something that you said about realism, that you said it sounds like a bad thing to bring realism into thinking about marriage and relationships, but it's actually really useful. Do you think that counter realism is useful too, to open up the possibilities for different kinds of arrangements? So some kind of anti-realism would be necessary and interesting to imagine other forms of relationship, living out relationships.
Yeah, I think this is a core tension, right? So I said that people think realism is bad because it's kind of boring, right? I'll be realistic about what, and the worry, the obvious and the most important worry is that, well, that will just entrench the status quo, right? That will just mean that people think, oh, what's realistic? Oh, well, that's just being monogamous like everyone else, whatever. And that's not what being realistic means. being realistic is actually being attentive to the part of you that says, you know what, that's kind of not what I want, or like, I actually really fancy guys and girls, and like I want my life to be able to accommodate that, right? So realism can be actually very disruptive because it can push against the kind of form of life that you think is easy or that you should be taking or whatever, because you're becoming aware of things about yourself or about other people. I mean, there are different kind of layers to realism, right? So it's a kind of attitude that's directed towards yourself, to other people, to your social world. And it also involves kind of taking on board general truisms, right? Like we know that it's very difficult for relationships to last a very long time, for a whole lifetime. We know that people experience desire for other people over a lifetime, right? We know this stuff, and you don't need to be, again, you don't need to have like read all the like psychology journals to know that. These are just common truths that you can just know by looking around you in your social world, thinking about people you know, the relationships they had, and so on. So being realistic kind of involves all of that. But yeah, you're right, there's this tension. Well, does that kind of shut down imagination? Does it prevent people from thinking about alternative possibilities? I don't think it does at all. I think that that's completely compatible. But the question is, well, enacting those possibilities might be very difficult. And people that set out to enact a possibility without thinking about the actual practicalities of doing that, the ways in which that process might shape them, the ways in which that might play on existing problems that they have, that would be unrealistic. And I think that would be potentially very damaging, not because it prevents them from a kind of achieving a preference, right? But because it might actually sort of undermine that person's ability to be a romantic person. And I think we see this a lot with non-monogamy, right? People think, oh, I've imagined this new way of doing everything. They set out to do it, and it can be debilitating. And so we have to be careful. So I think, yeah, a kind of, it's really important to kind of keep your mind open to the kind of experiments in living, as Mill would call it, right? And to do that involves several other traits that I haven't really spoken about, but one of them is kind of this ability to attend to the goodness that other people experience. So you might be able to imagine, you know, you might be a jealous person, you might manage your jealousy, you might get it under control, but you're still really bad at actually attending to the fact that your partner, you know, is seeing someone else, and that's actually a good thing for them, right? That further step, that appreciative step, might be really challenging. And so cultivating that appreciative ability is really important, because it allows other people to start thinking, well, okay, for me, I wouldn't really be able to live in this way, but I can really see why those people want to live differently, or why someone might think that this kind of different way of doing it is appealing. So there is a place for both of these things together. But I think the problem is when people don't take their agency and their agential ability seriously, and then they just end up really hurting each other, or they end up like dominating each other, creating situations in which people can't leave, or people don't have any kind of ability to contest the situation. And these are situations in which women and minorities are traditionally harmed, right? Like utopian communities which may be based on great ideas but lead to real problematic moral constraints on them, which not only kind of stop them doing what they want, but may actually really undermine their ability to be intimate in general in the future, right, with other people. It might be very difficult to reconstruct that ability, that trust, that openness. And so I think it's just really important to bear that in mind.
Thank
I have
you
a
for that.
question too. Your book was published during a pandemic. You mentioned a series of demography transitions that happened in history. Do you think the pandemic could possibly be a new transition of the kind? And do you think more people are going to be non-monogamous when the pandemic is over?
I mean, people have asked me this before. I sort of just don't know. I've heard both sides of the argument mentioned, right? So you might think that pandemics make or break relationships. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, at least in the UK, the talk of a lot of people breaking up, a lot of people that suddenly had to spend a lot of time together. If they weren't able to really communicate, get on, kind of organize their practical space, were really struggling, and relationships would end. Other people say, well, actually, no, they kind of foster creativity, get people thinking about alternative things and so on. Recently, I think there was a news article somewhere in the UK about the pandemic kind of encouraging sort of sexual exploration and sort of imagination, the things that you just mentioned your question the other day about people sort of considering other ways of doing it, right? You're kind of stuck at home and you can't go out. Like, how are you going to live differently? I'm skeptical that will translate into sort of non-monogamy becoming more prevalent. I don't see a direct connection. You might think that maybe it has the opposite impact for some people because they've been unable to interact with their partners during the pandemic. And that's had a big impact. So I don't know. I think it's just really, it's sort of a little bit too early to say. One thing that has seemed to happen, though, is it really focuses people's minds onto what matters to them. And so a lot of people have made very practical life decisions based around family, moving, more quality time. So if anything, it's kind of reinforced people's existing values. I don't know whether it's shaken up the values. I don't know, but it's a really good question. I think we have to wait a couple of years maybe, and someone will start writing books on it, and we can look at data and think about the impact. But from my anecdotal experience, it doesn't seem to be, for the relationships that survive, it doesn't seem to be changing them. If anything, it's making them stronger and kind of reinforcing those ideals that people have of family and time together and things like that.
Okay, we have another question from Michele. She says, "Thank you very much for the amazing talk. Could you please talk a bit more about the different types of freedom and their relation to romantic life, especially negative freedom?"
Okay, so this is a good question. I slightly worry at this point that my expertise in this area is not as good as it could be. But so kind of political philosophers sort of, have talked about freedom for a long, long time. And they've tried to think of different ways of capturing what we mean by this, or different aspects to freedom. And there's a question, a big question, the sort of theoretical question about whether, positive, negative are kind of different things, or if they're just different descriptions of what freedom actually involves. But to go back to that distinction, I mean, the thought is that sort of negative freedom is just the absence of restrictions, right? If you live in a society where there's so many laws and things stopping you doing stuff, you're not allowed to walk on the left side of the road, you're not allowed to look up at the sun on Tuesdays, you're not allowed to, then you're not very free in that negative sense because there's so many restrictions on you. Positive freedom, in contrast, is really meant to capture this idea that, like, you can have very few restrictions, right? There might be very few laws in your society. So, like, from that point of view, you can do what you like. It's just that you're hungry, you don't have any money, you're disabled and have no support, right? So, like, you're sitting there and someone says, "Oh, isn't it great? Like, you've got all these freedoms, whereas the country that I live in is lacks freedoms." And that person will say, "Well, yeah, it's great in theory, but I'm unable to do anything." And they might say, "I'd much rather live in a society where, yeah, there are lots of laws, but there's good public healthcare, there's social security, there are these things that enable me to live my life and to some, how I want to, and participate in society." So that's kind of thought of as positive freedom, at least as that kind of debate goes. But kind of a third strand of freedom, often called Republican freedom, because it's kind of anchored in the sort of Republican tradition of writing about ancient Rome and through to critics of tyranny and monarchical government in the UK and other places. Those people are sort of thinking, well, the really bad thing is when there's a tyrant in power, someone who can kind of change their mind and have you killed tomorrow, or can give you loads of money and a great political position and a wonderful house, but then take it all away. And you never really know if that's going to happen. And so people that talk about Republican freedom, so they often use the example of tyranny. They also might use the example of slavery, where you're being dominated by a master. Now, that person might be really, really nice, right? They might be the best master there is in town. So they might not hurt you physically, right, and so on. So you're kind of restricted in some ways. You can't maybe leave the plantation. But compared to other people, your physically and sort of emotional well-being is much better. You're being fed and cared for and so on. The problem is that person's still being dominated. It still could be the case that tomorrow the master turns around and can act violently without any repercussions, right? And so for the Republican person, that person's subject to domination. They may be treated really well for their entire life, but they're still being dominated by someone else because that other person could, in virtue of their social relationship as a slave owner, treat you in a horrendous way without any consequences, negative consequences. So people that are worried about Republican freedom, what they want to do is avoid those contexts of domination. They want to say we need to set up our society so that it's very difficult for a tyrant to come into power. It's very difficult for one branch of government to take over. And obviously there are very, very close associations between that way of thinking and people that write and think about democracy, and this kind of, relates to ancient Rome, but also the context around the civil wars in the UK, where people are thinking about getting rid of the monarchy, what should we do in its place, and so on. So how does this relate to romantic life? Well, the thought is someone could say, oh, let's be romantic anarchists, right? Let's just have no restrictions on what you can do. If you want to go and sleep with someone else, you can. If you want to go and have an emotional connection with someone else, you can. If you just don't want to turn up for dinner one day or whatever, you can. So you might think, well, that person has lots of freedom. There's very few restrictions. So in terms of negative freedom, they've got lots of freedom. But that person may actually be crippled by jealousy or insecurity. They may not have any time because they're working a low-wage job and they have to work long hours. They may be very tired because their work is manual, right? So they might have this ability to go out and date someone every day of the week, but they're just too tired and too anxious to do it, right? So in terms of positive freedom, they don't have as much freedom as someone who's got time and money and who's got the character that can actually do that. So they're confident, they don't have any insecurity. So that's kind of positive freedom. And domination we might think of in terms of traditional marriage in England or in America before, very recent legal reforms, right up to the 90s, right, where, women often lack legal rights. In some cases, historically, they were the property of the man. They weren't able to have property themselves. They weren't able to open bank accounts, make decisions, have custody of children. They weren't able, there's no such thing as marital rape, for example, until the 90s in some places, And so the thought there is that, like, for that person, for that woman in that situation, they might have the nicest husband in the world who treats them wonderfully. They have a wonderful relationship, but structurally they live in a situation of domination because they have no rights. Their ability to do anything is very contingent on the fact that their husband is nice, right? They could have had a husband that wasn't nice and they'd be having a terrible time. So structurally, in virtue of their husband's social role as a man in a legal situation that recognizes men and doesn't recognize women, that woman is kind of subject to domination. And so when we think about freedom in that sense, we might want to get rid of that domination, even if it doesn't mean that that woman's day-to-day life differs in any way, right? Maybe she's not treated better. Maybe there are actually more restrictions now on her freedom, understood in terms of restrictions than there were before. But she might have legal personality. She might be able to leave a relationship without negative consequences or whatever, right? So that's sort of as kind of freedom understood in terms of domination. And the general idea is that these kind of three things are kind of always in trade-off with each other, right? In order to give people the ability to enjoy their lives, we might need to tax people to raise money to pay for healthcare. And taxing you is imposing a restriction on you. It limits your freedom in one respect, but it gives everyone freedom in another respect. And similarly, we might want our political institutions to not be dominating. So we might try and organize the way government works so that no one bit of government has the upper hand, so that they're kind of checks and balances, for example. And the thought is, we need to make similar trade-offs in romantic life. And this matters because people that think non-monogamy gives all of this freedom to you might be neglecting your ability to make use of that, and they might be neglecting the way that that relationship is set up. You might have all the freedom in the world, but your partner could turn around the next day and take it all back, or they might suddenly be horrible to you and you're not able to leave for whatever reason, right? And so they're all kind of jostling against each other. They're being traded off against each other. And my worry with the argument of Chalmers in worrying about, monogamy is really restrictive is that, yeah, that's true to some extent, but it misses out the other ways in which it might be doing other things for people, at least when we understand it in terms of the particular restrictions that are in play. That was the general idea anyway.
Thank you for that too. I have a couple of questions more. I'm not sure if we're gonna have the time for both of them, but I'm gonna ask one of them at least. So something that interests me is the possible parallel between non-monogamy and neoliberalism, or at least the acknowledgement of how non-monogamy can be appropriated by neoliberalism. We were talking about this on Monday, actually, with Professor Ruti as well. And why do you think this comparison is misguided? And how can we know when the idea of non-monogamy is being appropriated by a neoliberal idea of efficiency? How can we think of non-monogamy as an alternative to unhappy monogamy? Without thinking in neoliberal terms of better returns for emotional investment?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the comparison is necessarily misguided. I think it can very easily be co-opted by that. And this is kind of why I wanted to try and get people to shift away from thinking of romantic life in general in this kind of individualistic neoliberal way, and thinking about it in general as a lot more relational. And that means that we need to maybe get rid of certain things, right? We maybe need to stop thinking about compatibility as this thing that we're looking for when we're dating. Am I compatible with that person? You know, that's a kind of neoliberal attitude that sort of says, I want A, B, and C. Does this person give me A, B, and C? And the thought might be, well, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but maybe tomorrow you're going to want something different, or maybe there's some other options that are going to emerge, or maybe your kind of character and their character interact in this really wonderful way that's completely unexpected, and sort of changes these things. And so I think that both relationship forms can easily become captured by neoliberal values, individualism, competitivism, comparativeness, the sense of emotional return, this kind of one eye on the opportunity cost, this kind of the sense that, well, I'm doing this because I want to kind of maximize my autonomy and my kind of notion of experience. And so I need to quickly ditch this person because there's a better person over there or whatever, right? Like, of course, they both can be co-opted by that. And I think that that kind of general attitude just rests on a kind of mistaken conception of persons, like what we are like, and what we need in order to do well. And I think, of course, there might be a place for talk of compatibility, but we would want kind of agential compatibility, right? Like, I'm this kind of person with these kind of abilities. My character's in a certain way. Is this person somebody that, when I interact with them, helps me maintain and even enhance, ideally, these things? Are they somebody that opens up possibilities of intimacy and vulnerability and so on, or someone that closes them down? So, that's a kind of compatibility, but it's not like, do they like the same food as me? Do they vote the same way? And all of this kind of stuff, right? It's more complicated than that. Particularly if we buy into this idea that what it is we value is often determined and shaped and filled out by other people. I mean, if that's the case, then it means that there's only so much that we can do in advance of getting into a relationship, which is kind of terrifying, right? On the one hand, because you think, well, I might be the kind of person that really wants to sort of do my research, get things right before deciding what to do. But it may be that that's never going to be possible. So there's always this element of intimation, the unknown, the relational unfolding of your interactions with another person. And so you need to be someone that can accept that and deal with that. And so I think that this is why I'm kind of focusing my project on what I'm calling virtues, or, you might just call skills or abilities or traits of character, because they're the things that you need, whatever relationship you take, right? Whatever form you take, you need to be a certain kind of person to do it well. And I'm not even talking about doing it really, really well. I'm just talking about the kind of person that can maintain that ability to be a romantic person. That's not a given. That's not something that we all have to the same extent at the same point of time in our lives. So it's something that needs to be protected. And you can easily trash that by quickly adopting a non-monogamous relationship in the neoliberal mode. Like, that can really undermine people. And of course, lots of people have that experience where they want freedom, or their partner suggests that they should do that, and they find it very, very challenging, and it can really impact their ability to relate with people as they'd wish. And that's not just a personal failing, right? Like, it's not their fault necessarily if they're born into a society that is very hostile to those kind of relationships, or which structurally entrenches uncertainty and ambivalence, and kind of gets people to think twice about their emotions and whether to reveal them and so on. That kind of social context will deform character. And so we all start off from a position in which our characters are kind of undermined by the world we're born into. So we're always pushing against that. And it's very easy to be seduced. Like, monogamous ideology is very seductive. And so is, for some people, emergent kind of the counter narrative of the non-monogamous ideal, equally seductive. So you need to be able to cut through the illusion, I guess, with a dose of realism, and sort of proceed on that basis. So yeah, I definitely don't think that non-monogamy is immune from these problems at all.
Thank you. This was really, really nice to hear. If I can ask you one last question, I promise it will be
go
short.
for it. I'm curious what it is.
I've been asking this question to all our guest speakers, and that is, how important has feminist thought been to the way you think about monogamy and normativity, to your work, or have you arrived to the theoretical place you are in right now through other thinkers and other influences?
It's a really good question. So I would say that it's been enormously important, at least understood in terms of feminist philosophers. So the people that really influenced me the most: Lisa Tessman, Andrea Westland, Margaret Walker is perhaps one of the biggest influences, Hilde Lindman, Iris Young, Elizabeth Anderson. They're all hugely significant feminist philosophers, right? And they want to contest the conception of the moral agent that often lurks in much contemporary philosophy. They want to direct our attention towards more complicated forms of care and dependency and vulnerability. They want to look at how our social structures often obscure those relations of vulnerability, or how our theorizing about it does that. And I think that's been hugely important. I mean, basically, those are the people that I draw upon most explicitly in my work, and sometimes maybe not as clearly as it might seem in the written version, but people like Iris Young, who resist this kind of distributive paradigm where we live in society, we're all concerned about who gets which stuff, and whether it's equal or whether some get more or less. And so, that's kind of a view that's very easily imported into romantic life. People can think about non-monogamy in that way, like getting more stuff or equalizing the stuff that we get, right? Whereas Young always wants us to think about the social relationships that we forge with other people and the ways those relationships are maintained and undermined. And so that's been that, the parallels of romantic life are so obvious. And I think it's been hugely important. So yeah, definitely those figures. And yeah, in the longer project I'm working on, a lot of the discussions of specific virtues have been shaped by these people. So Margaret Walker writes fantastically about integrity and criticizing sort of rational plans of life stuff. Cheshire Calhoun, I should have mentioned earlier, real big influence when thinking about lots of different things, but in particular contentment, this ability to be sort of satisfied with the good things that you have and that other people experience. Maria Lugones writing about playfulness. So yeah, hugely important. And of course, Iris Murdoch as well. Though you might, I don't know, some people might wonder whether she counts as a feminist given some of her views, but yeah, so massively important to me personally, and practically very important when it comes to the arguments that I'm developing. And if anyone wants to ever email me, and I can give you some reading suggestions, because I've got some sort of favorite books amongst all of those, stuff that's really interesting, and some of it is happening right now, contemporary people like Lisa Tessman, who I mentioned earlier. I'm thinking a lot about virtue. So yeah, massively influential, and I'm happy to talk more to people. Feel free to contact me and we can discuss it.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for today, for sharing your work with us. We're looking forward to your next projects as well. So please keep us posted.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Thank you
And
so much, Luke. Really, this was really interesting. I have learned a lot, and also everyone who's here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we'll continue the event tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.